Disclaimer: Stalzone is a work of fiction. The Covenant, their beliefs, and the events that occur in-game are purely fictional. This video is an analysis of a fictional setting and its themes, made for entertainment and discussion purposes. This video will reference real-world religious concepts and traditions, but it is not a theological, educational, or spiritual resource. Stalzone is a video game. The Covenant is not real. If you want to learn about spirituality in a serious setting, this video is not it. Don't start acting like you know everything about religion next time you're at the dinner table just because you watched this video. The Covenant. The Covenant is a fairly special faction within the world of Stalzone, since, despite borrowing some elements from what the original IP this game took inspiration from, it's the only playable group that can be considered wholly original to its setting. Led by a man named Metropolite, they stand out from their peers by being a group built out of faith and doctrine. Their dogma is peace and suffering, and this is applied in more ways than you can imagine just from hearing these words. This can be seen as early as their appearances. While most other factions sport their associated colors when in their default state, Covenant members don't have a habit of painting their gear purple. Quite to the contrary, when in this faction's hands, suits seem to take a fairly disheveled look. Sporting black and grey with rust-colored highlights, their equipment looks bulky, with helmets that seem similar to medieval designs and sporting cross-like geometries. This should be the first sign that, while eager to show their allegiances, doing so doesn't include performing maintenance on their equipment, at the very least, not anywhere beyond just maintaining functionality. I don't think I need to explain that a clean suit that isn't rusted and bulky is much more preferable than one that looks like a massive piece of copper dangling off of your body, but clearly the Covenant's sensibilities don't particularly care about comfort. Despite their assertions of a higher calling and looks that might make you think of them as weaklings sporting half-broken gear, there's a good reason why people consider them dangerous fanatics, cultists, and people not to be trusted. Religious radicals that wage holy war down to the last brutal implication of such a calling. To assume mercy from an enemy who has God on their side is to not assume much in the first place. The most obvious sign of this is the Covenant's most unique habit, vows. Known examples of this are vows of bread, in which you willingly starve, vows of steel, in which you willingly go out on patrol with nothing but a knife on hand, and the most notable one, the vow of suffering, which even Metropolite is known to partake of from time to time. This one has either you, by yourself, or with a group of your brothers, go out into the zone, willingly looking for trouble and suffering for days on end. This might make your opinion of the Covenant oscillate between them being masochists or ascetics, and while you're right to a point, this ignores another important fact of their beliefs. Suffering must also be inflicted upon others. From physical to emotional torment, the Covenant is something akin to an order composed entirely of whip-happy flagellants, eager to share the kiss of the lash with those around them. Violence is part of their religion to a foundational level, not to be avoided or dished out sparingly. Metropolite's flock sees suffering in all forms as a way of evangelization, contact with the divine, and ultimately the highest form of divine touch. Whereas most of the zone's denizens see pain as something to be survived, the Covenant sees it as something to be spread. Torture, starvation, suicidal attacks, and zealotry down to the last consequence, they are both the zone's greatest victims and instruments. This being due to their interpretation of the world around them as inherently sinful, with suffering itself working as something akin to a wake-up call. The world has sunk into sinful debauchery and pleasure, and so to reject such pleasure, they choose pain. But when put to the test against their contemporary believers of the Christian faith, where does the Covenant stand? A lot of you probably don't need me to say it just to know that if such a group actually existed, their behaviors and doctrine would be actively denounced by their brethren in belief. But why specifically? In this video, I aim to answer that question, and through that, maybe we could come to understand Metropolite's flock a bit more deeply, and in turn, maybe come upon a newfound appreciation upon this strange group of maniacs. Mercy versus suffering. Perhaps the most important distinction to be made, seeing as a large part of Christian history seems to be based and written from the actions and lives of people who have suffered greatly, it would seem that the Covenant has that covered in droves. But like in many things, the devil lies in the details, and just what exactly suffering should look like when done correctly, quote-unquote. The official Nicene view on suffering is that the mere act of suffering isn't automatically sanctifying or holy, but rather that it's an avenue or a medium through which the individual soul can come come closer to spiritual fulfillment. This is to say, while Nicene faith sees suffering as a chance to choose good, to choose hope, faith, and ultimately mercy, the Covenant seems to view suffering as an act of holy devotion in it of itself, not a transitional state, but the end-all be-all of religious fervor. To suffer is holy, and the more you suffer, the holier you are. But that's not where it ends. According to Metropolite's flock, suffering yourself is not enough. After all, if they kept their hands to themselves, they'd be creepy but a peaceful group. Instead, they are also fervently dedicated to spreading suffering to other factions. Indeed, it would seem that the Covenant's view of suffering is that it doesn't really matter where it comes from. That isn't to say the Covenant is indiscriminate and wanton in their violence. After all, their work is not only of devotion, but of constant evangelization. They're always willing and eager to look for recruits, and when you're a part of the Covenant, they can be surprisingly merciful, as proved by their recruitment of a Civcast soldier and the treasury quickly forgiving Lazarus when it was revealed he was stealing funds from the cult. In that same vein, lore-wise, I imagine both bandits and stalkers are off limits to the average Covenanter. While we don't exactly have access to their entire doctrine just yet, I'd assume that violence is directed and carries some level of structure and ritual boundaries, rather than it just being random cruelty. But who are the enemies of the Covenant, then? In strict terms, they are those who debauch, those who loot, those who try to destroy the zone, those who profiteer from the zone, blessed who reject the word of Metropolite, mercenaries, frontier, and, while not mentioned directly, Hurst, the Covenant representative in the bar, did say that Rice's research and protection of the zone is removed from divine truth, therefore wrong, therefore they're enemies as well. All of this is to say that, in the Covenant's view, there's not a single person in the zone who isn't an enemy, or at least someone ignorant from the divine truth that Metropolite supposedly holds. This is where, in a very blunt sense, you can easily see why the Covenant is feared by many other groups in Stalzone. They're a group who is known to employ violence, suicidal tactics, revel in suffering received and caused, and personally speaking, if you told me about these guys, I'd assume they're a ticking time bomb just waiting for the chance to start chucking Molotovs at the bar. The main reason why this is such a problem is that, in Nicene faith, when it comes to suffering, mercy isn't optional, it's the ultimate metric as to whether said suffering can truly be called Christian. Mercy doesn't just mean not smacking someone when you could do it, or not killing someone when you could. Mercy asks, what are you doing with this evil, this suffering you're experiencing, and how does mercy, your love, respond? Ideally, your answer should be suffering which begets love. In the Covenant's case, suffering begets suffering, which begets suffering, which begets further suffering. But then there's suffering taken to the extreme, one of the greatest honors that one can receive posthumously when dying for their cause, that of being considered a martyr. Throughout this video, my main information sources are Catholic, but something important to mention, specifically considering that the Covenant is based more on Orthodox faith, is that Orthodox Christians are straight up forbidden from actively seeking martyrdom, which Covenant members, the ones who aren't doubtful at least, pretty much jump at the chance to become martyrized, it would seem.
The Covenant! This is the Metropolite speaking. The military is occupying the north. They are numerous and strong. I said earlier, leave this battle to the Lord, and I say it again now.
Though they would probably argue that they are not looking to be martyrized, but rather looking for suffering, which sounds similar if you ask me. This is another aspect in which Covenant breaks from conventional Nicene belief, because while they look for chances to maximize suffering, conventional martyrization comes from remaining faithful when facing persecution. Faithfulness that is brought from charity and faith rather than the desire to suffer by itself. This is where one of the main breaks in Covenant and Nicene philosophy can be spotted, because conventional martyrization is seen as the ultimate act of faith and charity, in which a person, when faced with death for their belief, choose to proclaim their faith, and they in turn become united to Christianity's Messiah through charity, dying as he did. This is in stark contrast to the martyrdom seen in the Covenant, which, even if no name-specific cases come to mind, it's easy to imagine most deaths at the hands of pursuers come after a gunfight that, let's face it, was probably started by the Covenant member in the first place, which, mind you, is also in severe violation of Nicene doctrine. Martyrdom is not about choosing to suffer as much as possible, but to respond with faith when persecution comes to you. So much so that historically, there have been cases of people throwing themselves towards it, with there even being recorded statements after the fact. When 3 Christians of Caesarea in Palestine were persecuted by the Roman Emperor Valerian, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus said, "It is mere rashness to seek death, but it is cowardly to refuse it." Kind of a confusing statement, no? As far as I gather, this means that no, you should not go out picking fights and looking to die unnecessarily, but in that same vein, if righteous struggle or death comes to your doorstep, you should stand your ground and face it bravely. In short, don't seek death, but don't run from it either. Concluding point, martyrdom in conventional Christian tradition is dying in faith and union to Christ's own sacrifice. To do so appropriately, it must be faced with faith, charity, and not be something that you recklessly throw yourself at. Martyrdom, in Covenant's portrayal, is dying in search of and because of violence. It's not about bearing witness to one's own belief, but rather a byproduct of the acquisition of, bluntly speaking, devotion currency. The rejection of Christ's passion. According to Nicene teachings, humans are born carrying what is known as the original sin, this being a direct result of humanity's earliest forefathers, Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve shared the forbidden fruit, their descendants inherited this condition, which is described as a wounded human nature, deprived of the holiness and justice that was granted during original creation, and this remained the case for long after, all the way up to the arrival of Jesus Christ. In Christian tradition, Jesus Christ's arrival meant many things for humanity, but one of the more important feats that he brought upon the world was the redemption of the human spirit in all of its aspects, specifically during the biblical event known as the agony in Gethsemane. Even if you're not religious, you'll understand what point in the timeline this is. He already knew that Judas was going to betray him and the Romans were going to seize him. As such, he went to Gethsemane to pray and prepare. According to scripture, he grieved deeply, stating, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." What you want being God's will for him to be sacrificed, innocent and sinless, for the betterment and reconciliation of humanity and God. Once the Romans took him away and crucified him, this made Jesus' martyrdom accomplish Nicene traditions and really Christian traditions' most important foundational belief. Through Jesus' sacrifice, sin was washed away from the world, granting humanity with redemption from sin. This is stated to be absolute and not something that can be superseded, mind you, and no new revelations are to come. What's known as his passion being the single most important act in Christian teaching. This, if the covenant existed, would be the main point of inflection between Nicene teachings and the Metropolite's cult. By stating that the zone has become a new temple through which God cleanses the earth of its sinfulness, they are actively denying the importance of Jesus' sacrifice, which goes against the teachings of pretty much every single Christian denomination which isn't considered heretical. Mind you, the covenant does believe in Jesus and acknowledge his state as humanity's savior to some degree, since when talking to Raguel during the player's final confrontation, you can plainly reference the second coming. There are names for different heretical interpretations of Christ's passion, but the one that fits Covenant most seems to be that of Socinianism, a school of thought birthed by Lelio and Fausto Sozzini in Italy during Protestant reformations. Their claims are many, but the most important for our purposes is their interpretation of Christ's sacrifice, which, according to their belief, is that Jesus Christ, while born a miracle child and a prophet, was not God's son, but rather an exalted prophet whose death worked more as an example and a pledge of forgiveness, rather than any actual sacrifice made in charity for humanity's sins. What's the difference? Well, Nicene teachings state that Christ's death wiped away the deprivation from divine goodness and justice brought by original sin. Think of it like it healing a wound from the general human soul, quote unquote. By his sacrifice, he fixed something that was severed from God. Socinianism teaches that Christ's death was an example or assurance of God's capacity to grant forgiveness and grace to those who are willing to place their faith in the divine. This might sound similar, but Christian doctrine has existed for thousands of years now, so semantics and word examinations are extremely important in their lines of thought, as you might already have guessed. The Covenant goes one step further with their denial of Christ's passion by assigning themselves what amounts to a third revelation, that of the zone's spawning as a lash as punishment through which humanity must redeem itself, conferring upon all of mankind a state of sinfulness to be fixed through penitence or damned through inaction. By not only denying the importance of the passion and going as far as to assign a new type of original sin on humanity in short terms, they are acting as though Jesus' death was just something that happened, which, if you're not familiar with Christian faith, is the biggest no-no you'll ever hear in your fucking life. It actively goes against the biggest foundational truth of their faith. Metropolite's cult of character. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the man behind it all, the one and only leader and supreme spiritual guide of the Covenant's flock, the first and only preacher through which the word of the Lord is interpreted and spoken, Metropolite. Not much is known about Metropolite as a man, and what is known can be assumed to be embellished to a point. Said to have received a revelation during his early time in the zone, he took to preaching in the bar, where he was mocked by the people who heard him. Given enough time, however, his words snared the attention of larger groups. His work, not just that of a preacher, his true calling was that of a spiritual leader, which is when the Covenant was founded and began operations as a faction of its own. All Stalzone player factions have their own founding myths, and at this point is when the Covenant saw its own. Known as the Old Crisis, the Covenant grew at such an explosive rate that all the other player factions sought to destroy them. Lacking the equipment to fight back, Metropolite began dealing with civcas in exchange for apostle suits, which bolstered the Covenant's army enough to defend itself from attacks. It can also be assumed that he comes from an important scientific background, considering that during the events of the Northern Wars, Metropolite was revealed to have served as a consultant to civcas regarding the recruitment of murmur soldiers who make up the bulk of their private army's ranks. One must wonder then just what kind of methodology this man knows, considering the fact that while mercenary defectors make up their chain of command, many of the common soldiers and troopers sporting civcas gear are these ex-murmur soldiers. All of this is to say that, despite what preconceptions you might have as a player within the Stalzone setting, Metropolite isn't just some guy who popped up and started claiming things. His credibility was earned through his feats and his achievements, establishing a community, negotiating with powerful organizations, and demonstrating the capacity to contend with his peers. This, in turn, seems to have imbued him with a messianic reputation within the ranks of the Covenant, and while their commandments already assigned Metropolite with a uniquely divine duty, not only as a guide, but as God's voice on earth, his flock seems to have developed their own folk beliefs. With things like bottles of water being left in his room, considered sacred, warriors hope for the chance for their equipment to be sprinkled with it before leaving the temple swamps on their way towards suffering. His word is also considered to be absolutely and unequivocally final. During the events of the Northern Wars, Covenant was on the verge of schism, not because people had lost faith on Metropolite, but because they thought he was too weak to continue leading. Even the staunchest supporters of Raguel's splinter group became meek and abandoned their plans when met with Metropolite's presence and direct words. His influence seems to be engraved to such a point that, even during his final conversation with the player, Raguel acknowledges that there's much wisdom in Metropolite's teachings, and that if he succeeded in killing him, he'd like for his teachings to remain long after the man's death. Most interestingly, Raguel is the only final boss of the Northern War storyline to retain his faction identifier after his betrayal is revealed, remaining a member of the Covenant even up to that point. So, even if disillusioned on Metropolite as a man, the only known person to have actively gone against the Covenant's leader still consider themselves a member of his brotherhood, which might be a testament to how deeply Metropolite's influence runs. When talking about spiritual leaders and their followers, there's two categories of veneration: dulia and latria, the former meaning respect and veneration of a person, and the latter meaning worship which is owed to God alone. My main question here is, has the Covenant crossed that line? And truly, seeing what we have seen and knowing what we know, I believe that they have. If the Covenant existed and, noticed by the greater Christian community, their beliefs were to be categorized as heretical, what would that mean for Metropolite and his flock? For starters, physically speaking, nothing. Expo hasn't announced the presence of Special Ops Vatican militias like in Vampire the Masquerade, so it's not like they're in fear that a bunch of Coptics are going to drop by and start throwing Molotovs through their windows. The main effect of being declared heretical would be mainly theological and at a doctrine level. While the word heresy seems to be associated with it being a massively violent and explosive accusation, the fact of the matter is that established Christian denominations, nowadays at least, categorize something as heretical to separate that which is in accordance to their teachings from what seems similar enough to be confused. So, if the Stalzone Pope declared that the Covenant is heretical, that would be him saying, the Covenant guys, not real Christianism, their doctrine is separate from our own, what they teach is not what we teach, and their beliefs and behaviors are entirely separate from what our group over here believes and does. We do not co-sign them and consider them other to our faith. It would also mean that they'd be considered unfit to teach, proselytize, or evangelize in Nicene settings, and all of their rituals and processions would be disregarded. Mind you, this doesn't mean that joining the Covenant makes your player character irredeemable from the nature of their faith. Plenty of its members are probably taken in during times of extreme duress, which I believe falls under the category of misguided. Your in-game character isn't doomed to damnation just for joining. So being considered heretical doesn't necessarily mean you are immediately the most evil person alive. It just means that in the Nicene hierarchy, you just don't get to be part of their community. This brings me to our last question. Putting aside all that we know about our world, and considering the strange properties and logic that the world of Stalzone works under, is Covenant a true religion within the setting? Did Metropolite truly receive and become the newest revelation in the setting? Could this revelation truly be attributed to something divine, or could it simply be some sort of zone noosphere fuckery? Do opposing factions have a point when they dismiss the Covenant as a group of fanatic sadistic maniacs and or people being scammed by a cult of personality leader? Or is the truth, as it sometimes seems to be, a strange and somewhat irrational combination of all possibilities? Maybe the Covenant isn't fully enlightened, nor fully deceived. Considering the strange properties of this world, they might be somewhere in between.
Boil this alcohol.